Okay, for our member segment today, this sprung out of actually our playing of FAIYUM. We're going to talk about board position because I think I had made this observation to Paul or at the end of our 3-player game that like board position in this game did not mean anything. And Paul kind of correctly said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by board position here? So just kind of wanted to talk about like what does board position mean? What are we talking about? And then maybe explore some different games and how they explore the space of board position and use it in different ways.
Yeah.
So maybe I don't have a textbook definition, but I would say, like, when we talk about board position, we're talking about like the state of the game as represented by components on a common board. In FAIYUM, they happen to be common components on a common board that kind of makes a distinction. But I think, like, maybe to make this point, like, first off, let's talk about games that are just 100% board position. If you play chess or checkers or even like tic-tac-toe, the game is represented 100% by. Did I say tic-tac-toe?
I was like, you just meant. I was like, that was a game show, wasn't it?
Good game show.
Hollywood Squares. We're playing Hollywood Squares. Wherever they put Betty White,
all in be... master board position. Wink, wink. But yeah, everything in chess, you know everything you need to know about in chess in terms of like where the pieces are in the game, and even if you talk about something like score. In chess, score there is just a way of kind of like quantifying the board position. It actually doesn't matter. Like there's a victory condition that has nothing to do with score, and it's not like there's a separate score track in which you're saying black player is winning. Your score is just an indication of your pieces on the board and this value that we've assigned to certain pieces as a way of kind of just describing board position. So board position is not a score track. It is not your hand. And we can look at other ways at which things that aren't board position, but a lot of games are pure board position.
Right. I was under this. I was under the understanding that it's more. Well, board position to me seems like it's actually a pretty large umbrella term of like this is just where pieces are on the board, right? Like I'm like if it's an area control board, I have pieces here, you have pieces there. I'm thinking more in terms of, boards, how we develop a board, an actual playing space, right? Like that's where I'm thinking about it in terms of like where things are, where things are on this board, how we are creating a space that we can put our pieces onto and generate actions and things happening. That's sort of like my mental frame of reference.
Like we don't have an exact definition here, but like when we're talking about board position, like we're often talking about a map, right? Like when classic board position is a map, you were mentioning area control, like area control almost by definition means that this is like a competition over areas of board position in the map. So it's like it's a representation of a space or an area, and your pieces on this representation have meaning, generally in terms of strategy or tactics or even narrative. It's also something like there should not be like hidden information. Hidden information is outside the realm of board position. Like this is stuff that we can look at and we all understand what we're looking at, and there's common understanding. Where I think it gets a little fuzzy is exactly like what we call the board. If we're playing Agricola, is board position like where we are in terms of our worker placement spaces? Like that doesn't feel like board position to me. That feels like something else.
That's not one I really think about with this category, because I think of that as it's worker placement. We're sending workers to places, and we're creating our own specific little private board, which is kind of like an abstraction of a tableau.
Yeah,
there's board. I guess there's placement in terms of where you put your fences and how you put your vegetables
on an individual board.
Right. So, and where you place them matters because with the fences, where you place your fences matters because of further fence expansion like you could get yourself hemmed in, or you may not have room for. I haven't played Agricola in a long time,
but it
like
does.
your
I guess
pumpkins.
to make my point, generally, there's a few cards that make an exception to this, but generally in Agricola, it does not matter that the 3 clay space is next to the 4 wood space, right? Like the geographical representation of those things doesn't matter. There's just a place where you can place a worker. Right. And maybe the map in those spaces set up in such a way that more spaces are going to open up. But like, I don't have a position that in fact, what you're going to do at the end of each round of Agricola is you're going to remove your pieces.
Yeah.
Right. So that's not board position.
But it does not matter if you take the leftmost worker placement spot versus the rightmost one. Like that, it doesn't matter. And that's okay in Agricola because that's not the focus of it. It's fine. We just talked about FAIYUM, where it also doesn't matter a lot of times where you're building certain things, and it gives us mixed
but we
feelings.
wanted it to.
It gives us mixed feelings. It feels like it's a game that is going to where it is going to matter, and it mattered in certain cards if you happen to have them, but in terms of intrinsically in the game state, it doesn't matter.
One of the criticisms we've leveled at I have leveled at a lot of games of recent years is more of a move away from a common board into individual personal boards. Now, I'm not saying that in itself is a bad thing. I love Agricola, and Agricola, you have a personal player board where you're building your own farm. But like when you do move to the individual player board, you probably are moving away from a certain amount of aggression or interaction. So much of board presence can be like you're competing over areas with area control, or like in our train games, you've got a common board, and your placement on the map there can actually like deny opportunities to other people, and like you either like that kind of interaction or you don't. But that is also like the realm of board position. If you're playing an 18xx game, you can look at that board and you have a position. Like you have a board position there that represents the actions you've taken in the game, and it has meaning going forward. And when we play games with personal boards, generally we're moving away from those type of player to player interactions.
So what I would love to do is talk about the things that I look for in a board, in a collective board experience. And then maybe we can talk about some games that fulfill it or don't fulfill it, or as like examples of that.
Sure.
One thing that I really like in a board, a collective board game is I like what we talked about earlier, is the idea of creating opportunities for other people, right? Like everything I do on this map is going to service me, but it's going to create an opportunity for someone else. I like that because you have to think about what they're thinking about. You have to think about their motivations. I think that's just a fun, interesting idea. I think probably the king of that is actually Brass, where it's like, oh, so and so made a coal mine. Okay, well, I'm going to do something that's going to take advantage of their coal, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're going to respond to everything that you do on this map. I'm going to respond, and my response therefore goes onto the map, and then someone's going to piggyback off of that. Like that is a really fun mechanism that I look forward to. I think we see that. We see it in FAIYUM. We see it. Wildcatters has that to a certain degree. I don't know if have you played Wildcatters? It's like a oil drilling game. But, someone puts up an oil rig here, and then maybe I might build some infrastructure. So when they want to transport their oil, they've got to go over my infrastructure. I like that shared incentive that comes from a collective, a communal board.
I like this as a good way of thinking about it. Is like, a game with a board and board position can either be kind of like creating opportunities for other players. A lot of other games are denying opportunities for other players. Like rail games, a lot of times are about denying opportunities to other players too. But it's nice to have that flip side of, common space, creating opportunities. Can I play off of things that other people have created?
18xx games actually are a lot about creating opportunities, because if I'm going to make a rail line to go from Chicago to Detroit, I've now made a rail line for everyone to use to go from Chicago to Detroit, and it can be used against me. Now I've given someone access to a city, and then they put a token down, and now I can't access the city that I built the infrastructure for. Right.
Right.
So that is actually
That's great.
a really fun, sometimes cutthroat quality, but that's what it's like.
But it's highly interactive. It's highly interactive.
You have to think about where do they want to go? What would they do if I do this? What will someone else do? So that's actually a really fun part about 18xx, and you see it lesser. Well, you don't really you get similar feelings from Age of Steam and Railways of the World too.
Right? Yeah, it's a little different.
It's a little different, but it's that same thing. I also I like this. I like seeing a sense of growth on a board. What we talked about before. Mm-hmm. I like seeing a board grow and develop, and feels like as we are playing our game, we are also creating a world right in front of us. That's just like a fun thing to do. You know, it's a fun experience to look back at and be like, look at what we built, look what we made. Right.
I think that's interesting also because it immediately says like that's the opposite of chess. Because like chess is like the maximum position is at the beginning, and then it's going to be like degraded, and it's going to be it's going to open up as you play, as more and more pieces are removed from the board. And like I'm with you where I tend to like where you kind of like start with this open thing and then you see what gets built over the course of play. That's always an interesting story when done well.
It's also interesting. I think we see that Carcassonne is probably the most classic example of it. You can even say about Catan. Catan has that where you look back and see how these little settlements all built up around this world you've created. Suburbia is that's not a communal board, but it is something. Expanse City I mentioned earlier. I haven't played it, but I've seen pictures of these awesome cities that people have built. And it seems like half the reason people play that game is just to see what city springs up on their table, which I think is really fun. Barrage, where these dams show up. It's not quite as exciting. It's not as visually exciting, but, I still can see that these things going up on your board.
But yeah, board position is at the core of Barrage. Like Barrage has a lot of things going on. It's worker placement, and there's different ways in which your like game can be represented. But I think the more you actually do focus on the board and the links that you are creating, and that's another great example of how your position there can create opportunities for others, but also sometimes deny opportunities. Like there's competition for the spaces, and so a lot of the things you do create opportunities, which is one of those reasons that board is so interactive and engaging.
Yeah. I also think that what's really, really important when we're talking about board position and eliciting meaning out of games that have board position is that where you put things on that board matter. Like, it's cool to create opportunities for other people. That's really fun. And having it look cool is fun. But it should matter if I put something in spot A versus spot B.
Yeah. That should position matters. Yeah.
What's around it, what it gives me access to, what it denies people access to, how it gives me points. That should matter. It should not just be an arbitrary thing, which is what we found in FAIYUM a lot of times.
Yeah.
I think Terraforming Mars, you like to bring up Terraforming Mars in this regard, right? Because where you put those tiles actually has a huge impact.
That's right. When you're first learning Terraforming Mars, the board is kind of a mystery, and you're putting things down. I'm placing cities, I'm placing forests, and it's hard to kind of understand like, oh, there's actually a pretty deep positional game in Terraforming Mars that's always running, that especially at the more competitive levels, you play a more competitive game, like your placement on the map matters a lot. And that's actually like the center. Like, yes, there's all these cards you're playing and resources you're gathering, but in the end, your port position, especially based upon playing certain corporations, matters a lot. And there's a lot of interesting interaction on the surface of Mars, as it should be. And that's why that's one of the great classic games.
And you know what? And that game does something smart with its map, which a lot of games do, which is that it creates meaning in its hexes by a lot of times putting bonuses down. So, because sometimes you just may have an entire world of hexes. It's like, well, who cares? But you start putting bonuses down. Now you've got incentives. It matters why I go to this hex versus that hex. And then And then because I put something in that hex to get that bonus, that now means that placing around whatever I put down is now going to be important for me and for other people, right? So I think something that's good for designers is putting those bonuses down are helpful. And actually, you see that in 18xx too, oddly enough. You don't really see often bonuses for putting things down, but certain cities will have a higher value and they will increase in value more. So like you are more concerned about building into those cities, or some of the terrain has a surcharge. So you're also interested in avoiding that terrain. So just doing things like that can help make where you put things very, very significant. I don't know if you ever played Dinosaur Island. Did you ever play Dinosaur Island?
I haven't, no. I had my own Dinosaur Island game I was working on for a while, and now I've been beaten to market
twice, because there's also Dinogenics, which I'm intrigued to play. I've never played that. It's supposed to be like a Dinosaur Agricola, but Dinosaur Island was this like very hyped game, and I backed the deluxe Kickstarter and everything because I love dinosaurs, and I was like, oh yeah, it's basically Jurassic Park the game. Like you're gonna make your own Jurassic Park, you know?
Yeah, it's great.
And it had all sorts of cool stuff. And ultimately, you are doing these things to put dinosaurs on your tableau, and where you put the dinosaurs did not matter. And I was like, how?
Right? How do you have this Dinosaur Island game where the dinosaurs are? It doesn't matter.
Like it's like, how do you have a T-Rex next to a Brontosaurus, or a T-Rex next to a Ferris wheel? And that's not going to matter. It's hilarious.
It has no meaning. Yeah,
it has no meaning, and it made the entire game feel very empty to me. Mm-hmm. And it really bums me out, because you should consider things like that.
In Dinosaur Island, do the dinosaurs end up eating the tourists?
Yes, they do.
I mean, that has to be in the game, right? Like that has to be a core part of the game.
They do, because there's a mechanism where you have to be building up your security at all times, and if like the threat from the dinosaurs surpasses the security, it's going to eat tourists. But I actually think that there should be an element where it's geographic. Like,
yeah, there's a board position element. Or
people, like there should be a game that is simulating designing a space where you have danger. I think that geography should matter.
Geography, yeah. All right. Are there some other examples of games that you want to kind of explore here, of where they're playing with board position in ways that are interesting or different?
Yeah. I actually think probably the king of all these is Roads and Boats. That is like the board position game. And what Roads and Boats, it matters where you put things. Every time you put something down, it creates a potential opportunity depending on how the map is laid out. The other thing that Roads and Boats does that I really like, that we were missing in FAIYUM, is that the things that you build in Roads and Boats do things, right? You build a road, and it makes it easier to move resources. And the easier it is to move resources, the better you can convert them to turn into something else. And when you can turn something into something else, then you can build something better. And like the more you build on that map, the more useful the map becomes, and the more utility it becomes, more utility it has. And if something becomes more and more useful and easier to access because you built roads and the boats, then the more people are going to come to use your stuff. So that is, to me,
Roads and Boats is a super important game to discuss, especially in context of FAIYUM, because it's engaging in the same space of, hey, we have this common map. And when you build something on the map, it doesn't belong to you.
Yeah.
Right. So that creates an interesting space, an interesting interactive space. The difference is that Roads and Boats does not go 100%. You have nothing on the board that belongs to you or matters. It's very limited. In terms of like the donkeys you control, or something. There are certain things you control in this common space, and that's where all the richness is. That, to me, FAIYUM lacks, because it's completely common and has no meaning.
Yeah. Yes and no.
Okay.
So the reason I'm saying yes and no is in Roads and Boats, the only thing you have like a home tile, which is not that significant.
Okay.
I'm gonna take that back. I'm gonna get yelled at. But you have your transport.
Who's gonna yell at you? Is Tom gonna yell at you?
Probably,
Okay.
but but you've got your transporters, which may be a raft or a donkey or who knows what, and those are your own, and any resources that are on them, therefore, are protected by you.
Right.
So that's your only sense of ownership. And in FAIYUM, the resources you gather, unlike in Scythe, those resources belong to you. So you do have ownership in FAIYUM. It's just that it's not owned on the board; it's owned in front of you.
Yeah. Your resources don't live on the board. Your resources live on the board in Roads and Boats, right?
They live on the board and Roads.
That's
and Boats.
right. You never take the resources from the board and stick them off the board next to you and saying like, "This is my wheat. This is my wood." But they're on the board and they're not 100% guaranteed, right? Or
if they're on the board, anyone can take them. If you put them on your little donkey, if you literally put
which is limited
your stone on the donkey meeple or your raft, it is very cute and fiddly and will drive you nuts. It belongs to you, right? And so again, it's just there's it belongs to you, and then you can transport it. So you're using the infrastructure that you've built, because you're using a road. And then maybe you take it to a raft, and then you take it across the ocean, and then you bring it to another place where then you process the resource. So it's like, it's not just that you're building stuff. The stuff that you're building does things and creates things that make things more useful to you. And by the way, that's what I like. I like that.
All right. So do you have, is there a game when you think of board position that is like your favorite game that is 18xx, are those like the board ends up having the most meaning and the most fun for you? Or is there any other like one you want to point out of like, this is a game that does board position right?
I mean, I personally think 18xx and Roads and Boats to me are like pinnacle board position. I think Food Shade Magnate should also be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
Because that game, you have a tangle of roads in this suburbia, and it's not for nothing. It's not just like a cool world that's created. Like how those roads lay out will impact how you deliver your food and what the competition will be. So the geography means something there. So I think that's a good one. We talked about
let's stay on that one just real quick, because I just want to circle back around to our discussion about like common board versus personal board. I think the games you're mentioning there, I consider those all to be, those are fairly complex games. They're also high interaction games. And so like maybe as a more experienced gamer that you are now, like these are the kind of experiences you want. Mm-hmm. These high interaction games, and you're willing to risk, because I think what happens with these high interaction games like these is that you're actually like, you're risking a bad experience. You're risking a negative outcome from your interactions. Yeah. And you're okay with that. That's the kind of player you are now. And so like, it's important to identify that that's part of what these kind of common boards often are and can be. And it also explains to me in my mind, like why we see so many games that get away from a common board or have personal boards, because if your goal is to create a positive experience for all players where win or lose, you did your thing and you built your farm somewhat in Agricola, or you ended up with your thing. It's like, hey, I came in last, but I had a nice time doing the thing I was doing. You're going to opt for more of a personal board design space. When you play Roads and Boats, you can honestly kind of like, you can get your goods stolen and somebody's wandering off with your geese on turn 1 or turn 2, and you're feeling like, oh, okay, I'm ruined.
Yes, and Roads and Boats is an interesting one because that game is the maps. It's not just one map. It's like the map is created the way a Catan map is created, and there are several scenarios. So you may wind up in a scenario where you're actually on totally different ends.
Yes.
And you may not actually really
interact. And others, you're on top of each other.
Yeah.
It's super sandboxy.
It's super, super sandboxy. But when you have these communal maps, the issue is that someone can really just mess with your plans. Like, you don't have as much control.
Right.
And so, like, yes, it's cool because you're constantly thinking about the opportunities you may create for someone, but it's also the opportunities that someone may deny you as a result. Mm-hmm. And when you're playing something with your own personal board which, by the way, don't get me wrong, I love that. Remember, I love me some
love
Praga Caput Regni,
God.
the multiplayer solitaire game of the year. I mean, I love that game.
God.
I'll just bring back Prague trauma for you. But
I've moved on. I've moved on.
That one tried to have some board position stuff in it. It didn't really.
Right. Like that's a good example though. Like I think we kind of like wanted the common board to have more meaning and more of the game to kind of play out in that common city map. And you also, like, as you've expressed earlier, like what you wanted when Praga is to have the sense of like, we're building a city where we start with this thing where there's not a lot there. And by the end, it looks like Prague. And that definitely doesn't happen in that game. If that's what you want to see happen in that game, it does not really happen at all.
Yeah. I also like in a communal board, I like the idea that you're interacting with I don't even know how to say this. It's not like it's an autonomous system. I don't know the words to put this in, but like that there are things that are happening on this board that like imagine you're standing by the highway and there's cars going by and you have to get to a city and the car is just coming by and you're just going to hop on that car and get to that city and you're hoping you're getting on the right car, meaning that there's something that's happening on this board and you are trying to kind of like deal with it, but you have some control over it. I don't even know if this makes sense to people.
You're interacting with the board itself, right? Like not every game is just this empty hex map of blankness that we're then going to populate. Plenty of times there's features
it's like a river current that you're shaping. Or something like
if you're going to play High Frontier, like you're heavily engaging with the map.
I haven't played High Frontier, actually.
The one which you're sending, rockets, out to parts of the solar system. Yeah. So you're heavily engaged with the terrain of that map. Is that kind of what you meant? Like that it isn't just the other players sometimes.
It's the system of the game. So I think about On the Underground, which is like a really excellent light midweight game that I've talked about several times that I really want to play with you, Trey. Like I actually, it's a great game. And the way it works is that you are building a subway map and there's a passenger. There's one passenger. And so you add onto the map, like literally almost the only thing you do is just add onto the map. You just build more rail. And then there's a passenger and there's sort of like an AI that says after you're done building, the passenger wants to go to this location. And so the passenger is going to hop on the nearest subway. It might be your subway line. It might be your opponent's, and going to travel in the most efficient way to a location. And so what you're really trying to do is you're building these lines, hoping to get that passenger to ride on your rail, right? And to sort of like manipulate this AI. And that is so fun to me because I think it's really cool that we're making a subway map and it looks like a subway map. And then you can imagine if this was a subway map, imagine like riding on the subway and getting off and having to make this exchange, but also really cool to see how this like NPC is just traveling along these rails and like manipulating in a way like that's actually a really cool thing when there's just a system in place and you're just everyone's manipulating it. And when someone manipulates it to their favor, it then massively affects how you are able to manipulate it. We see that in Barrage also with the water falling through.
That's right. That's a good way. Like the water is this element, and we can adjust.
It has its own rules.
Has its own rules, and we're competing for that water, and we're tweaking the system, trying to get the water to come into our dam, so that we can gain energy from it. Yeah, no, that's an interesting way of putting it. It's not just, and I think that's like why sometimes we stray from older style games where it might be like we have this position on the board and then we're gonna fight, right? Like we tend to stray from those and then we're gonna fight kind of games. And so it does tend to be this more like competing for resources. We're competing for those water or we're blocking opportunities rather than straight up, my 6 units are now moving into the space where you have 3 units and we're rolling dice and resolving that. That's risk. Like risk is 95% board position plus cards.
Right.
But like, yeah.
What about diplomacy? I've never played it, but you played it, right? Didn't you guys used to play it all the time, or am I making that up? How does that fall into this? Would you say?
I would say it's a one. Your actual position in the game is 100% board position. But what's interesting about it is that the rules are so simple that the social interactions are what matter. And the board position cannot represent, to some extent, the narrative. Like, you come and you look at the board, you'll see who has 7 supply centers, who has 11, and who has 2. But that won't tell you that Italy stabbed Austria-Hungary on turn 2, breaking a promise, other than there's green units where red units used to be, type of thing. But yeah, that's a pure board position game, in that, like, you don't have, nobody in diplomacy has money to the side. They don't have resources that they're going to spend to build more armies. The armies they can build are a reflection 100% of their board position and the number of supply centers they have.
Yeah. Where do you think the Transcontinental fits into this conversation? This is, I think, both of our favorite game of last year.
Yeah.
And it has, when I talked before about on Agricola, it doesn't matter if you're on the leftmost spot or the rightmost spot on Agricola, it doesn't matter. But in the Transcontinental, which action spot you take matters, because there's a sequence of how we resolve them.
Proximity matters.
And on top of that, there's also, I think we have a communal resource pen, essentially. Like, our resources are held communally together on a train, and how we access them matters very much. I think the Transcontinental plays a lot with board position in ways that we've never really seen before.
Yeah, maybe that's kind of like one of the maybe we didn't identify that before, but like, there is something magical about how Transcontinental took a worker placement game and essentially added, like, board position to a lot of the placement. Like you said, it matters where you have a presence in these regions. Like, what's next to each other, because there's an order in which these things are going to happen. And even, like you pointed out, our resources on the train, like where they are on the train, will often be the ultimate decider of whether you will do something or not do something, or get in on a certain territory. Is my wood at the beginning of the train, or is it at the end? Can I kind of sneak in? So I think that's part, maybe the secret of its success is this interesting overlap between board and worker placement, in a way that earlier I was trying to identify, that I was trying to segregate out. Like, worker placement, and like the common board in Agricola is not really board in the sense we talk about board position, but in Transcontinental it is.
Yeah,
you do have a presence on these worker placement segments as you play the game that you can only go to, and it matters if it's next to something or across. When you place certain spaces, it matters.
Yeah,
it all matters,
because we've seen before a game where there's spaces that then get resolved in a sequence, and the sequence matters. Yes, but I think the Transcontinental does take it to the next level, where pieces have to be considered. And I guess what's nice about it is that it kind of adds an element of nothing is really taken for granted in any of these games. Like, it's not like you just do something, you take an action. You have a whole layer of decision making about what you're doing. That's really cool. I've actually thought, I have never designed the game, but I've actually felt like I've thought about this before, that one thing that would be really cool in a game design would be that where you are on the score track, which is often just a static, not like you move on it, but the score track is just a thing around the edge, and it really doesn't matter beyond scoring or something like that. But what would happen if where you are on the score track has a physical impact on what you can do on the board game?
Yeah, there's a word for that. That's called a race game.
No, but
think about it. If the condition is get to the end, like, then your position on the track is kind of like where you are on the score track.
No, but what I'm meaning, that if I am on spot 22, I have now closed off a part of the map, and I'm not going to open up part of the map until I get more points, if that makes sense. Like, it's not just like that has an impact on our board state. Not just like obviously being higher up on the track is going to have an impact on the stakes of the game, but like that it actually impacts how you interact with the map based on where people are. And so I've sort of toyed with that idea. I haven't really come up with anything, but again, it's that idea that nothing on the map is something you take for granted. Like everything is an interaction in some way, which I think is, and that's what these games all get towards, which is really fascinating. Even something like Keyflower, where you are making your own little map in front of you, a lot of times you're making that map trying to address other people's needs, right? Because you want people to send their meeples to you.
Well, that's the thing. It's like the Keyflower personal map is not truly a personal map. Yeah. Other people, it's a worker placement spot that you can access and other people can access. It's not immediately obvious, especially on your first play. You're not thinking, should I be playing on other people's maps? But that's where the game is actually quite rich. It's such a surprisingly good game, Keyflower.
And the meeples themselves are actually, they're semi-communal, right? They're yours, but then you kind of are relinquishing them. Like that's an interesting.
Depending on how you use them, you like lose control of them. I was thinking with Transcontinental, it also that game also passes your kind of like I want to build a city test, or like what's the narrative that you're going to see play out. And like Transcontinental does successfully tell that story of we're building this train line across Canada and we're opening up parts of the country that we're then going to be able to access. And by the end, you've completed that train line and it looks like something. It looks like you've completed the train track, and it tells that story the same way. Like it builds an interesting city is what you want.
Exactly. And as it builds, the functionality changes too, because you're actually developing these areas. So functionality grows as you develop this very abstract linear map. I think the only other game of significance that I want to mention, two games, I guess the cost also falls into this. The cost is a funky one because it really does. It is about board position, but that's a funky one. And I haven't played it in a while, so I actually am not going to touch it. But that's another one where board position and how you develop the board can really matter. And if you're not paying attention, it can get all wonky. Some of these games have that wonk element, which we talked about in FAIYUM, that if you're not paying attention, it's like the game saying, hey, you build your map however you want to build it, but be careful because you might create some real wonky stuff here, right?
Yeah.
But I also wanted to mention Fast Sloths again, because the way Fast Sloths works, this sort of gets into a little bit of on the underground too, is that you are a sloth just trying to get to a tree to get some food. And there's like 6. Have you played it? I forget. Did I already ask this?
I bought it. I haven't played it. I want to play it.
Oh, yes, that's right. So there's like 6 trees. There's this landscape, this beautiful sort of like jungly landscape. And there's like 6 bananas. And you as a sloth, you just want to get to your banana, man. And you want to be the first one to collect all 6 of your bananas.
That sounds great.
But you're a sloth.
All right.
And unfortunately, sloths are slow. So you hitch a ride with all these other animals that are nearby. And as a player, you basically move your sloth with these animals. Each animal moves in a different way. An elephant moves slowly, but can throw you with its trunk like 3 hexes away. And a giraffe can pick you up from a few hexes away and then take you, and then ants can carry. It's like all these funny, thematic, interesting things. I do want to, I want to point out that in FAIYUM, those cards, we didn't talk about, those cards were very thematic, and I really enjoyed that. So bonus point for FAIYUM for that. But these animals, they move around the map, and they take you to where you need to go. But what happens is if everyone's moving these animals, you may have a plan like, oh, I'm going to hop on the elephant, and I'm going to take the elephant to the ants. I'm going to take the ants to the eagle. But then someone moves the ants and you're like, how do I get to the banana? You know?
Friedman Freeze is such an interesting designer. Yeah, some of them are a little, I don't want to say hit or miss. Some have hit better for me than others, but I like the way he's approaching games. And so even with something with FAIYUM where I kind of say, ultimately, I don't want to play this a bunch more, I'm really happy that I did. And I'm happy that hopefully people have enjoyed this kind of like discussion of board position, just because it's just started me down this line of like reconceiving how I'm thinking about certain games, and also like what I want out of my games, like how certain games interact in terms of board position, kind of like we were pointing out, like it depends on the kind of gamer you are and the type of interactions you are, and like do the pieces of your game end up producing the type of interactions that you find yourself craving from a board game experience.
Yeah. And by the way, is it rude of us that we have not even mentioned Power Grid in all this talk about Freedom Freeze and board position? I mean, how do you feel about that with board position? I know you're trying to wrap it up, but still.
No. I mean, I think it's board that relies incredibly heavily on board, right? It's all about making links between cities, and then you have these peripheral systems around it that support it quite well, right? Of your actual like power stations and having the right resources in order to fuel them. But still, like, 80% of that game is your presence. Like, ultimately, you're going to be victorious by having the best board position, the biggest, most extensive board position in that game. And so I think Freedom Freeze has been, exploring different ways to interact with boards and the way people connect on the boards in all of his games. Fresh Fish is a podcast favorite that simplifies this. I think Freedom Freeze is like, even when it doesn't hit, it's interesting. And I think that he is kind of like Splatter adjacent.
Yes.
His games do have a lot in common with Splatter, and often are like 1 degree simpler. Also, they're a little bit more accessible. And in fact, if you took a game like Bus and you said that's a Freedom Freeze game, like, I would totally have believed that, right?
Yeah. Speaking of Splatter, I think I also just want to mention The Great Zimbabwe, because that one is a really, really fascinating use of board position. And it's almost like your brain melts a little bit, but it is so clever in how it uses this, as usual, with Splatter, kind of like communal sources of resources that have to trace specific paths, and where distance matters, and how you build your things relating to those resources and your access to resources matter. And I think what's cool about that is that thematically, that also matches real life. A lot of the way that our cities and our societies have developed is their access to the resources that they need. And so when games can pattern that, it feels immersive because it matches life. The Great Zimbabwe board is very abstract looking, but it feels rich. And the game is rich because it's something that is that is forget the word, innate. I don't know, but it comes from a very real place and real needs, and the stakes feel real because you need resources to survive, right? And so it works. It works for that.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, you very well might enjoy the other videos you now see being suggested to you on screen. Also, we'd greatly appreciate it if you could like, share, or subscribe to our Game Brain channel. Thanks so much.